Hey, Life Group leaders, good morning or good evening or whatever time of the day it is when you watch this. This is the internet. I forget that sometimes. Anyway, welcome. We're going to talk about our next lesson in Amos today. It comes out of chapter 4, and it's got some great points in here for us to think about and discuss in our classes and ponder as we go through our week. So Amos starts this chapter coming out of the gate swinging. Let's just read this first verse here. He says, "Hear this word, you cows of Bashan, who are on the mountain of Samaria, who oppress the needy, who who oppress the poor, who crush the needy, who say to their husbands, 'Bring that we may drink.'" So right out of the bat, he calls the Israelite upper class women cows of Bashan. Now, men, I would not advise you to ever start a conversation with this phrase ever in any context, okay? Unless you're a prophet of God, then you may have the protection of God and it might be okay. Other than that, no. And then we're going down, verse 4, Amos is really doing an odd thing. He's attacking the Israelite people for their sacrifices and their tithing. And, you might wonder, well, isn't this what they were supposed to be doing? And so what has got Amos all riled up? And so that's what we're going to talk about, and God explains it. This is a pretty simple, straightforward lesson this week, so I'm going to try to make it short for you. And, you should have a lot of discussion time in your classes for this lesson, so it'll be great. So we're going to find out what's going on these next few verses, but there's some clues here in these first 5 verses here. Amos has some really strong words in verses 1 through 5, and then he's going to give God's explanation in the rest of the chapter about where they're at and what's about to happen, and it's not good. Amos had a really tough job. Bashan was an area of prime pasture, and they raised cattle there that were really well fed, well cared for, very large cattle, a large breed. So it was the Old Testament Wagyu beef, if you will. And they were well catered to, and so this would have been a very good alliteration that the people could respond to, and they would understand what he's talking about when he used this term. But let's be careful of the context, okay? Amos was not condemning these women for being wealthy, okay? That was certainly not the point. And if you get that, then you're not reading this properly. Their failure was the way they were staying wealthy or becoming wealthy was oppressing the needy, not having mercy on the poor. As a matter of fact, they were trying to subjugate their husbands, which was not the role they were supposed to take. Not because I said it, not because, Moses said it, but because God said it. And so they seem to be breaking a few of Moses' laws, like being greedy, lack of compassion, not having any mercy, any of these things ringing a bell. And so they were really taking advantage of the position that should have been a blessing to them, but that's not how they saw it. Likewise, in verse 4 and 5, the Israelites were making offerings and tithes to show their superiority. They were showing it so that people would look upon them and say, "Wow, look what old Jeremiah over there is doing for us." And so they were completely disgracing the purpose of these things that were supposed to be for the glory of God. So how do we know this? Well, first of all, let's just read. So Amos tells them in verse 4, it says, "Come to Bethel and transgress, to Gilgal and multiply transgression. Bring your sacrifices every morning, your tithes every 3 days. Offer a sacrifice of thanksgiving of that which is leavened, and proclaim freewill offerings. Publish them. For so you love to do, O people of Israel, declares the Lord God. So this is a condemnation of how they're worshiping. So first, they're supposed to be worshiping in Jerusalem, right? But they can't. Why? Because they're divided with Judah, because of their transgressions. So they had to set up altars in Bethel and Gilgal, and they did so without God's direction. And so again, another problem with this. Secondly, Amos mocks the tithing by saying they should tithe every 3 days, which is a jab at a tithe they were supposed to make every 3 years. And you can read that in Deuteronomy chapter 14. And then thirdly, he's saying they might as well bring offerings that had leaven in them, which obviously was not supposed to happen, was supposed to be condemned. It was forbidden. And then finally, he says, you should publish the fact of what you brought and how many times you made offerings, because this is what you love to do. And so, they were just doing it completely wrong, completely for the wrong reason, leaving God all but out of it. And so that was the problem there. So Amos uses these two things, the women, posturing because of their status, and then the tithing and the offerings, doing it, out of wanting to be political about it. And so Amos states God's judgment in verse 2. So in verse 2 it says, "The Lord God has sworn by his holiness that, behold, the days are coming upon you when they shall take you away with hooks, even the last of you with fish hooks. And you shall go out through the breaches, each one straight ahead, and you shall be cast out into Harmon, declares the Lord." So this was a prophecy of the Assyrian exile that's going to happen. And probably when the people heard this, they were thinking that, again, Amos is just using some imagery with the hooks and all this. But we know from history and later that literally the Assyrians put hooks in the Israelites' upper or lower lips, usually the lower lip. And that's what they took them out through the holes they had made in the defensive walls of the city. And so this is going to happen. And so, this prophecy that Amos is giving should have made them tremble with fear. And obviously we know that for the most part it did not. So then the next few verses, so going into chapter 6 and the rest of the chapter, God basically through Amos is telling them, he's reminding them of all the punishments he sent them to try to get them to turn back to him. He says, I've given you more than enough chances to not come to this point, and now it's too late. And so you might go through a couple of these. I'm not going to go through them and read them, but you might go through a couple of them with your class and discuss, how that might have made you turn back to God and why it probably didn't turn them back at this point. The discussion of these verses is whether God does the same thing to Christians today. Does he try to get our attention today through judgment? Either in our local church or just as Christians in general, in America, worldwide. And so I think the New Testament, would give a resounding yes as an answer to that question. We know the early church was certainly despised and had a lot of hardships. And Jesus himself, when the disciples were talking about the greatness in heaven that they would all have, he said, are you serious? Do you not understand what you've signed up for? Being one of my followers, the world's going to hate you because it hates me. And I think as Christians today, sometimes we don't think about that enough, and and we see that all around us with a lot of the Christian movements or so-called Christian movements, especially in America, where it's trying to be a blending of culture and Christianity, and it just doesn't work. Okay, it just doesn't work, and so we've got to be very mindful of that, and that's what happened here in many cases. Again, in other parts of the Old Testament, it talks about this very time when the people were coming and giving sacrifices to God, and then they would mosey on over to the temple of some other pagan god and do the same thing there. So they were trying to straddle the fence, and that just doesn't work. God's a jealous God, and we know that. So Amos goes through all these things that God did to try to turn them back to him. And then in verse 12, he says, "Therefore, thus I will do to you, O Israel, because I will do this to you. Prepare to meet your God, O Israel." And he's talking about verse 2 there, what's going to happen. So this is going to be a horrible time for the Israelites when the Assyrians come and conquer them. There's going to be a great deal of pain. Families are going to be ripped apart. Lots of people are going to get killed, and they're all going to be exiled. So it's not that they're just occupied and they just get to stay in their house under a rule like the Roman rule did. The Assyrians are going to literally take them away, take them to a strange place, and enslave them. And then finally in verse 13, Amos reminds them who God really is, the almighty power of the universe. His might exceeds anything we've ever known. His intelligence is something we can't even comprehend. And we're his children. We're the heirs of the eternal kingdom. And it should put us in awe, just like it should have put the Israelites in awe, being the chosen people of God. But they were quite the rebels, right? And so are we. We just don't acknowledge it all the time. And I think if we acknowledged it more, that would help us be able to have a better relationship with God and get on our knees more, get in the Bible more. So we can see the fallout here of not paying attention to God as he tries to get their attention through all of these things that he did. And I think he does that to us today. And if we are a little more attentive, I know if I'm a little more attentive, it would be beneficial to me. God's our loving Father. He wants what's best for us. And so as he puts the gutters up to try to keep us on that straight and narrow path, we need to pay attention to that and be obedient to those small judgments that he gives us. Part of it is just being in the Word. These Israelites knew what they should be doing, or for the most part, they should have known, and they just weren't doing it. But knowing it, you start to forget after a while. And as they had more and more idol worship and didn't do the things that God wanted them to and just went through the motions, that's when they really started having problems and they started getting away from the Word. A couple of weeks ago, I know Pastor James was up on the stage talking about a bit of a change we're going to have with the children. The children are going to come into the church. And this warning, you might talk a lot about in your class, the warning that he had about the offerings and the tithing. There's a right way and a wrong way to do church. And then there's a whole lot of other stuff, right? How we do the singing, how we do the preaching, how long it is, when we have it, all this, that's really kind of subjective. But there's a foundation of what worship needs to be like. And I think the illustration that Pastor James gave of children sitting in church with their parents and watching their parents worship God as an example, that's so powerful, so much more powerful than anything Lifeway could ever write in one of their little deals they have for the kids. So, I thought that was a great move, and not saying that's how it has to be done, but I think that's how the early church probably did it. And Jesus, told the disciples, hey, you don't understand. These children need to be here and hear this. And so I thought that was fantastic. Looking forward to that happening in our church. But we need to always be cognizant of that how we do church is very important. We need to be there to glorify God. So how we do it, what do we do the singing first? Do we do the second? Do we pass the hat? Do we, have a bucket at the back of the church? None of that matters. But what does matter is that we are there for one reason only, and that's to glorify God. And that's one of the main things that Amos says here that the Israelites forgot. And so we need to always concentrate on that, make sure that that's why we're coming to church. So have fun with the lesson. Again, I told you it's pretty straightforward. Amos doesn't mince words. And again, he has the strong backing of God. He needs it after that first verse there that he says, and but he has it. And so I hope you guys have some great discussion. Have a great week. Thanks.